Don't worry.
There's 3, 4 more. But I guess we're on.
Hi. Also because I have these 4 packages of slides. Or one is really the big one that I put this side. Just let them run all the time. Okay. So one here, one here, and these three.
We should set it up for lunch. Your fundraise 2 days. Yeah. Set it all up during lunch.
I just thought it might be fun. Have all the time, and then you have no worry, and I
We
say
should take
whatever I say.
extra time before come in here and set it all up exactly.
Okay. No, it's not. It's whatever.
Can be done.
So, that's so fast.
Yep.
Hey, Remo, do you want to presentation?
Yeah.
Non riuscite a
So good morning, guys. Good to have you here. My name is Martin. I'm one of the organizers of this nice venue. With me, as you probably know, there are other organizers, Ludmila Lackova, Tyler Bennett, and our dear colleagues from various universities. So it's my pleasure to have you here, all of you, and let's start with some formal things. First of all, the Wi-Fi is working, so here you can see the name of the Wi-Fi and the password, so you can connect and enjoy it. If you need something, tell me or to my dear colleagues, which is Alena over there, and Wojciech. Can you stand up, please, to see all these important guys here? Martin, yes. Aneta over there. So these people are here to save you, to help you, save you. Yeah. And now it's my pleasure to ask Ondra to say some things. Ondřej Vácha is our pro-dean for international relations,
Public
relations, and so on. So please, Ondřej, floor is yours. Something. How do you feel today? And
Yeah, I'm feeling great. By the way, if you should know, but what to add actually, I'm welcome all. I have to say, I'm quite surprised just how many of you are here, and not, for example, in Austria, swimming in the lake, etc. So thank you very much for attending the summer school during the summer. And again, thank the organizers, thank all our students who helped with the conference, thanks all the presenters, and hopefully, and be quite sure that you will enjoy the summer school for 5 days actually. So enjoy your stay in Prague, enjoy the summer school, and thanks again to all for actually sharing the space-time, the semiotic space-time, the semiosphere actually with us. So thanks.
So hi guys, my name is Jana Kurtula and I will be the moderator for this session. So Martin already introduced himself. I believe many of you know him already. And his contribution, I mean, the title changed a bit.
yes.
But it doesn't matter, it's shorter, it's easier for me. So, sorry. And as from your abstract, Martin, it doesn't work. I understood that you will guide us through the darkness of semiotic cliches, right? Concerning the metaphor. So, thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, I changed the title a bit. My plan was to talk about hobbits, but I failed. So I will present much more standard paper. And it's fine to be first because I can quote some passages from Burroughs and so on that I suppose you all be quoting later in the summer school. So my aim is to present some ideas, motifs that I think, according to the book of abstracts, will be more developed and discussed the whole. Oh, can you hear me? Great. I would like to present some ideas that I think that these topics will be discussed in this whole week. So, there is no better. Oh, wait. 1, 2. There's probably no better, as Umberto Eco said, scandalous sign, which better embodies general semiotic assumptions as metaphor. Well, the most common definition you probably know, which involves transferring meaning based on external similarity, itself poses a kind of mystery, a riddle. In other words, it raises a series of complicated and complex questions that I think lie in the very core of semiotics interest. What exactly is this transreference? What constitutes this foundation or ground? How do we define something internal, external, in which capacity, in which reason, respect, and what do we mean by similarity, and also what do we mean by similar concepts like likeness or resemblance and so on. So the question is, can we indeed safely include under the umbrella of metaphor all its various forms and ways in which this process appears across the multimodal universe of our cognition? Well, Percy's semiotic is well known, is entwined with his synergistic metaphysics. The doctrine consisting in the initial thesis that the indeterministic universe is defined by the general force of mediation, and that its main aspect is its evolutionary continuity. Yet, we still encounter attempts to enclose Percy's processualist view in flimsy compartments in which signs are understood as some kind of autonomous entities. From this perspective, we would say, like Roman Jakobson did, metaphor is an icon, metonymy is an index, since the former sign is sign of similarity and the later sign of coexistence of the part and the whole, thus bringing our whole encounter here to the end. You can feel that. I would like to explore another perspective. I would like to compare some selected aspects of Percy's semiotic, where I completely agree with MC Haley, who said, I certainly do not wish to reduce metaphorical similarity to logic in any sense, except that sense in which logic means semiotic. I would like to compare some multiform verse with other different but, let's say, fundamental viewpoints of metaphor, which are inherently semiotic, I think, but not strictly in a Persian way, which is Aristotle's analysis of metaphor as perhaps the most important figure of persuasive and creative speech is poetic and rhetoric. Aristotle, proto-semiotic viewpoint is based on his conception of sign as linguistic sign, especially in his the Interpretatione per Hymenaeus, on interpretation, and also as inferential phenomenon, like his analytics. And the third author I would like to mention is Nietzsche and his accent on rhetorical, metaphorical, and also inherently semiotic, I think, nature of language and his notion of metaphor, taken from his early lectures on rhetoric. So that's the plan. In Aristotle's optic, metaphor is not only an ornament of discourse, it's a complex discursive strategy. Now I mentioned the famous passage from Poetics, where metaphor is introduced as important trope schema for our reasoning and understanding. Quote, metaphor consists in giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. Good metaphor implies the intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars. This transreferential or transinferential structure can be described by the meta-language of categories, as in categories. Metaphor can be transference from genus to species, from species to genus, from species to species, that you probably know. The important fact, which made metaphor much more mysterious, is that any metaphor may be understood only through the metaphor of transfer. In other words, through the metaphor of movement or motion.
we can stipulate it for Plato and Aristotle, this infinite movement can be stopped in like some truly general theory like Plato's idea of height of genera or in Aristotle's metaphysics. But despite these attempts to lock this force of metaphor, this constant movement of or the processual trans-reference or trans-signification, metaphor still represents a constant tension. I think that's why we're here to delve into these problems. Well, the point is that this specific trans-references are not completely subjected to the order of formal logic, but also are subordinated to other complex realms, social, personal, historical, etc., to some specific situationality. In other words, are interconnected with the poetic, living, and creative side of the representation. The important fact is that a metaphor may be understood only through the metaphor of transfer, in other words, through the metaphor of movement. How vaguely do we feel, experience, or conceptualize motion that is not motion? As Roger Stratton observes, if we turn our attention to a music space, we find that we are unable to speak of it except metaphorically. We speak of pitch, for example, where the tones can be higher or lower, chords can be diminished or augmented, etc. Or if one speaks about the movement of harmony or melody, nothing is high or low, nothing is augmented or diminished, nothing is moving anywhere. So here the metaphor truly represents some important part of our cognition. Well, and I think that there's nothing less philosophically satisfying here than any form of dualism, through which we can see the metaphor, and it's problematic. Pure realism relegates this movement to the realm of spirit, mind, or soul. Vulgar physicalism to some oscillation of objective bodies. Neither of these perspectives can describe the cognitive importance of metaphor, musical movement, and space. Following Claudio Paolucci here, loosely, cognitive importance of metaphor lies in the shaping the process, how we come to know the world. It's not accidental that Aristotle emphasized the importance of guesswork in metaphors, in rhetoric, where the possibilities of metaphorical expressions are to be considered from linguistic question of meaningless sounds, inferential, like antonymies, and social, the need of social cultural background in understanding of metaphoric expressions. So this point of view creating our understanding of what is metaphorical expression. Thus, with this idea of that metaphor is referring to some guessing or some something that is in some moment unknowable or pose other questions, we can move to Nietzsche and his interpretation, who can be read as the one who refused in a way some metaphysical sentiment, Marxist pure thought of static metaphysics, and so on. But the important point is, for Nietzsche, this essential tension between static ontological structure, where metaphors are subordinated to some meta-ontological structure, and processual side of metaphor. It's not a problem, but it's an important part of representation and language. Every philosophical language must to live in this stream of metaphorical expressions and critically reflect it. The point of departure of Nietzsche's reflection lies in common practice of language usage, not in some static structure or God's eye perspective. It is to be judged when and why usage of metaphor is fruitful, leading, successful, useful, or useless. Successful metaphor is not only a proper understanding of interrelated conceptions, but it has its rhetorical vividness, craft, which is not subordinate to the vocabulary of some metaphysical presence. Or, I mean, the problem is where metaphoric expression is visible as metaphoric thanks to some givenness of things in Greek hardcore realism. The most striking feature, I think, for this issue is the fact that this deliberativeness of metaphor is not the invention of new words, but possibly infinite process of transfer of signification and has no true and one origin. This semiotic, non-essential, constant reinvention and reimposition is then the true core of language. So the infinite transfer is perhaps made by poets, homothetes. However, it is always fixed by the taste of community. So I'm daring to use some aphorism. You can sum up this position, Nietzschean position, as Jules Deleuze did. Who is interpreting will to power, and to move to some different field to say, but yeah. What is important is this, I'm trying to show this movement from will to power to will to metaphor, which is what is the source that forces us to use metaphors to judge if they are useful, if they are innovative, novel, or they are like these coins without the picture. So every metaphor is a living thing in very strict sense that is no mere figure of speech. Paraphrasing first here. The body of the metaphor changes slowly, but its meaning inevitably grows, incorporates new elements, and throw off the old ones. So, what are the limits of metaphor? How they can be recognized? What is indeed needed to recognize the true or literal meaning of metaphorical language or metaphorical expression? What is this empty space of intended but in a specific way incomplete proposition? So this dilemmatic reality of metaphor that we cannot speak, about metaphor without metaphor from some neutral, non-semiotic zone of language, this peculiar semiotic reality of metaphor makes this fact more visible. When we are looking for suitable words, we are trying to fill the gaps in the structures of language and choose from possible paradigms through comparison. When the right word can be found, invisible become metaphorically visible. Metaphor is most on hand when emotional and energetic interpretants momentarily occupy the space of logical or final form of interpretation. The Metaphor is, on one side, the most common tool to express our motivations, behavior, feelings, and opinions. Understanding metaphors of a historical, cultural, social era is the most important way how to become a member of these cultural units or social groups. Understanding metaphors is the most important tool for orientation in our living world. Taking metaphors literally would make our world completely horrific, unintelligible, and our existence unbearable. On the other side, the attempts to lock metaphor into ontological structure are useless. In other words, understanding metaphors in their social context with the interconnections to their abductive structure is a leading principle of our orientation in the sphere of anthroposemiosis. That is why the understanding of metaphor is essentially connected to the so-called pragmatic or abductive side of language. This means that usage of metaphor is constant deliberation between its hosting and parasitical forms. The model of living metaphor and of living in the metaphor has specific cognitive, sociolinguistic, and socio-semiotic consequences. Proper knowledge of metaphor leads to proper social acting and can lead to social benefits in the same way as misunderstanding could lead to social oppression or exclusion. Various forms of mutual competitive or parasitic symbiosis, so-called metaphorical and literal meaning, creates the way to recognize what is proper and what is inappropriate. This is another aspect of dual-sidedness of metaphor, which can be analyzed and also used as a form of danger rhetorical fallacy, as in the case of Nazi propaganda and their use of biological and medical metaphors for oppressing Jews, typical Jews are parasites and so on. Understanding of metaphor, which is constantly socially deliberated, is then an important criterion of identification of those who are inside and those who are outside. Every culture has some unique metaphors, which are symbols, drawing symbols, laws which are correlating the proper and inappropriate use of interpretants, but are also symbols in the sense that shows the unresolvability universe. In a more concrete way, metaphors and learning how to use them symbolize the unresolvability of regular type of language. So, first semiotic brings these perspectives, which can be described as some constructivist and structuralist or view on metaphor to some specific synthesis, because as you know, for metaphor or metaphor is for us rather helpful figure how, as you said, scientific mind discovered new symbols. So this openness of metaphor, this possibility to learn something new or find something similar in the similarity is for us an important aspect, which is interconnected with the scientific or the structure of scientific hypothesis. Metaphors are signs that shares some qualities with the object, and therefore, as per said, can be considered as sort of hypo-icons, which represent the representative character of representamen by representing a parallelism in something else. Metaphor is specifically connected to this, as first called hypo-iconicity. On the other hand, the process of understanding metaphor, of course, is connected to its specific usage, and also with this inductive testing. What do you mean that by that? And with some even communal habits, understanding of metaphor is based on or in iconicity, but still it's impossible without considering its use and agency. In other words, it's in executivity and symbolicity. This symbolicity has two faces, as every symbol has. On one hand, symbol is a law. On other, it's open to further interpretation. On one hand, it's governed by a rule. On the other, it's inherently insoluble. It's growing. It possesses a hidden part which has to be examined. Again, what are the limits, borders of proper usage of a metaphor? So that's it. These are my thoughts and ideas for this session. So I'm looking forward to discuss with you this week, and thank you very much.
So about habits.
Yeah, concerning habits. My plan was to speak about the guessing in the dark, the race in the dark, where Bilbo and Gollum are playing the game of riddles, as you know. And what is interesting is this shift when they started, and they are doing this quite common, like guessing the riddles, and then Bilbo became quite sophist and says, what is in my hands? Pockets. What is my pockets? And Gollum started to be what is usually in the pocket? The hand. Bilbo just put his hand off, and we started what goblins have in their pockets. So this was my idea to use as an example of the connection of metaphor, especially in the riddle, because the riddle is, especially this interesting in Hobbit, are structured as a metaphor. You have to guess, and you have to inductively test what is this similarity in the similars to solve it. And it can save your life if you are guessing, so help playing the game of riddles with Bilbo. And then this unfair shift from Bilbo, who start to say what is in my pocket. Guess what is in my pocket. So guessing still Gollum has to guess, but in a different way he did in the case of the riddles. So yeah, that's
That mic is right.
No, it doesn't work. I will.
okay.
So everyone. Wait, all right. I can play the Hobbit. Well, can you hear me? Right. Because it's, well, thanks very much, Martin, for taking us from Pennsylvania to Nietzsche on one summer Monday morning. Thank you very much. Now, if I may, it was very interesting. It was very rich. If I may, I have a simple. Well, the question is simple. Will to power. I think it's a really cool optics to take on metaphor. Sorry, will to metaphor. I think it's a really cool optics to take now. Isn't that, maybe I'm oversimplifying here, isn't that person significance or Brentano's intentionality?
Yes, it is. My point was to what strikes me that what is this need to judge something as proper, living, dead, visible, invisible, because in Aristotle's rhetoric, when Aristotle is talking about the good metaphor, he's talking about the metaphor that is inconspicuous or something like that. It's not recognized as a metaphor. So I think behind this classification of what is a good and bad metaphor, for example, rhetoric, that this is this will to judge the metaphor as something appropriate, inappropriate, on place, out of the place. And so that's what I very clumsily described. This is will metaphor. Try to show the resemblance with this idea of will to power, which is also to be reduced to some acts we are doing, but some more general. So yeah, and you're right. Especially in first metaphysics, this will would be allusion to love, and it has a different connotation. You're right. Also with different example, but I don't not much over now. So yeah.
Thanks, Martin. It's really comfortable to say that metaphors have a surplus of meaning, they're untranslatable. We just definitely open them. So what can you tell us about what's anchoring the meaning of the metaphor? What are the limits of interpretation that makes us actually understand a metaphor in its pertinent way? Is it context? So, yeah. Okay. Like what make Gollum and Bilbo coincide?
Thank you. I would say that if I can go with the so I think the structure of the sign in Aristotle, if one look into Herminius and this idea that the sign is on one way something communal of placitum or Katasintheken, on the other hand is something that is traced in the soul. So this is one conception, so for Aristotle, the meaning is at the end in the things themselves. Well, this print the soul, and then there is a huge thing that everyone has to say at the end. The perception is at the end very similar to your mind, because the things are same. But of course, the linguistics marks, as he says, are different. So that's Aristotle. For Nietzsche, I think this constant imposing, or also he says, well, this philosophical idea to judge something as tasteful or tasteless, well, it just it cannot be methodologically defended. Or so he said no. This fact that there is no ursprung, no origin, is the fact of the language itself. That's it. The illusion of philosophy is to find some good-like perspective where this metaphorical vividness is stopped. And for Peirce, I think the answer would be in his notion of inference. And also, it's also in Peirce, one can find these strong ontological claims, which are like, there's a light which is connecting the mind and the world. If it would be like that, we all need that. You know, there's a still chance to be right about something. Of course, the universe is psychistic also, so there's nothing like some ultimate principle which governs the universe. So our inference, especially in hypothesis, okay, when we see that something is similar to something else in some circumstances, we can infer that in the future the similarity will be same. This is one of his definition of affection. And we can test it. So, and at the end, we can find that yes, these cases are really part of the presumed rule. Of course, he also said, but this is not in the hand of the individual, but of the community. So the community is at the end, and here this idea of like even historical community and this transcendental community goes through the. So first, I think this will be a master what stabilizing the metaphors. In other words, some very final interpretations as habits. So, yeah. Thank you for this tough question.
Okay, so thank you very much for this amazing and interesting presentation. I actually have two questions. When you mentioned that the metaphors were connected to the living beings, I just keep wondering, was that like this poetic statement? Because like in the original literature, of course, metaphor is defined as this like figure of words in poetry. So, but again, words do have like life in some sense, because in the beginning there was a word, like in the famous Slavic like history texts. So I'm wondering, is there like a poetic statement into this? And then my second question is, so when you mentioned like the metaphor is like linked to the objects, but you said it belongs to hyper-like iconicity, but shouldn't it belong to indices? Because indices are like, according to first, connected to the object. So yeah, those were my two questions. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you much, Anna. The first question, it was my paraphrase, of course, for every symbol is a living thing. So every metaphor is a living thing. So I think but my aim was to show this. It's not only ornament, of course. Aristotle started with this idea. So when Plato said, well, yeah, that's why since Aristotle, not much was written about the metaphor. And but I back to this that the metaphor is a living thing. Of course, because when the metaphor is used, then it's living. That's it. That's stupid way. I don't that one. But then another point is connected what you mentioned. It is the problem is to think that metaphor is only an icon. It's not. If we consider this as a sign, it's also proposition. Sure, because and the proposition doesn't have to be only verbal; it also visual, and so on. So and therefore, when I say he's a pig, of course I'm using symbolic expressions, which are the words of language. I'm denoting some classes of indexes, this and that, so on. I'm also doing what Aristotle described as this transference from species to species. And I'm also understanding that he's not literally big. So that's why I think that sure, metaphor is the core of the metaphor, let's say, or metaphoric sign is iconic, but it cannot be think without its connection to some cases and to some general rules which are symbolic.
Thanks, Martin. Excellent presentation. Question was raised more or less like, why Nietzsche? Or why not just Echo or Aristotle, whoever? But you mentioned ontological hierarchies and you mentioned transcendental signifiers. Perhaps the question is really how may we distinguish metaphor from non-metaphor, or distinguish good metaphor from bad metaphor? And your point, I guess, in raising Derrida and Nietzsche, all too easily we may confuse the figurative for it literal. Yes, meaning special procedures, critical procedures, one kind or another. So you're presenting a kind of spectrum of positions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, for a comment, if I get it right, Eller?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And for Nietzsche, according to his early lectures on rhetoric, he says that there's nothing like non-metaphorical nature of language. And the source is this idea, which is Greek idea, metaphor is a movement of something. But it is not a movement. And then she said, oh yeah, that's it. No more illusions like we poetic and rhetoric, very shady things of philosophy. No, they are just inside of philosophy and other things of language. I think I'd like to be examined. Right. Go.
Thank you. I was wondering, if we broaden this concept of metaphor this much, at what point does it lose its meaning and does it just become the core of semiosis?
So what do you mean? If it loses meaning?
Because it's so broad.
If I can understand from Percy's position, sure, metaphor can the interpretation of metaphor can be with feeling, or can be specification, or some concept. So it's a matter of a habit and interpreting how the metaphor works in some. Because for Percy the meaning is not something that is static or can be grasped in some logical function or of language and fruit language, but it's still pragmatic, which means that the agency or the acting is the meaning of the metaphor. So if I feel bad about this metaphor, I'm going to, I don't know, find someone or whatever, love someone. So yeah, that's it. I think it's just strong play for us to sign cannot lose the meaning because it doesn't make sense to lose the meaning if something is signed.
I mean the concept of metaphor itself, right? And we broaden it so much that it's present in almost all language, in all meaning. Does the concept of metaphor lose meaning in our discussions?
Yes, you can. Let's say,
That's about it.
on the other hand, yes. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay. Your presentation finished that in metaphor we have some parts governed by rules and others that are hidden. I think this dynamics is pretty interesting. And could you tell something more about this process? How could we find the governed by the ungoverned parts, by the hidden? And it is connected with the riddle, the enigma you mentioned for Aristotle. And in this passage, when he speaks about the riddle, there is this part that the language we use in poetry should combine familiar words with metaphor. If we use only metaphors, the speech will become a riddle. And if it's used only unfamiliar or conceptual words, it could become jargon is a translation, but in original is barbarism. So if we speak only with concepts without using any metaphor, our language, our scholarly language will become pretty ununderstandable. So could you tell us something more about this dynamic between familiar, unfamiliar words, metaphor and concept? And in this part, Aristotle said that within the metaphor, we could grasp the impossible combination of words. What about the impossibility? hidden in the process of engendering metaphors?
Thank you. This idea that, as you probably guessed right, I made this rhetoric figure of comparison of symbol and metaphor and with some expressions and substitute the word symbol for metaphor and it works. This idea that symbol is connected to something which is present and which is unpresent is very old, of course. Go back to ancient Greece and to people like Hugo from St. Victor. And of course, compared to like, oh, there's nice to say about it, especially in terms of interpretation and the semiotics and philosophy of language. When he worked on this double side of symbol. On one hand, symbol is something is strictly cognitively convention, like letters of the alphabet or mathematical marks and so on. On the other hand, the symbol also means allegory, like in general anticism, and also the content of the symbol is this final resolvability, which is, I think, similar to how we understand metaphor. So yeah, my answer is to go to it, like this idea about it's tracing of the idea of, or the concept of the symbol in different eras, especially this connection to allegory and to convention. Rebuilding this argumentation of this tension. So it's one, and and for the second question, I'm not sure if I can answer in a few minutes. So let's discuss it later, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Nice discussion, and thank you, Martin, for your nice talk. And I would like to invite another speaker of ours, Remo Gramina from University of Turin, Italy.
See if it works. Technician in the house? No. Oh, there it goes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. I'm truly happy to be here today. And at this International Semiotic Summer School in Prague, I'm really honored. And I take also the opportunity to thank the organizers of this event, Dr. Tyler Bennett and Dr. Ludmila Lakova, for putting so much efforts in holding us here all together. And I'm also truly happy to see that there are so many participants coming here today. So thumbs up to everybody. This presentation, I will be providing you a journey. So, and here the word journey is indeed a metaphor as well. Just some background about myself. In the last few years, I've been working at University of Turin, Italy, and I've been part of a research team which is led by Professor Massimo Leone and is dealing with the idea of face aesthetics in technological societies. But to our talk today, discussion on rhetoric, metaphors, and figurative ways of meaning-making goes back to the earliest day of philosophy and has continued ever since. Historically, philosophers, rhetoricians, lawyers have the most to say on this subject. They have generally addressed the question of how it is possible to use language as an instrument of persuasion, indeed, and also how to shape attitudes in others and influence their behavior. The word in English, the term figure, which comes from the Greek schema, was used for the first time in Anaximenes of Lampsacus. The issue then was taken up, as you just heard from the previous keynote speaker, was taken up, deepened and discussed in greater details by Aristotle first, who proposed indeed the first systematic treatment of metaphor, and then was, let's say, taken up again by Roman lawyers, in particular by Quintilian and Cicero. But many of the thinkers in antiquity have discussed this subject at length. Today, this subject has definitely regained momentum. Such matters are at the forefront of discussion, arising interest among ordinary people, experts, and academics as well. So this concept, the concept of metaphor, resurfaces today under many new guises and new terminology, especially in a world which is indeed dominated by images. So terms such as visual rhetoric, visual metaphor, multimodal metaphor, pictorial metaphor, etc., they are representing some illustrations of the pervasiveness of this phenomenon, first of all. But not only that, this terminology, which in the past was somewhat part of a toolkit of philosophical concepts, today has become, let's say, the vocabulary of everyday life. People use such concepts. And they make up also a sort of socio-technical discourses, especially around technology. Now, as it is clear from my title of my talk, which has been reshuffled, semiotic approaches to the concept of visual metaphor towards an oblique semiotics. I will come back to this term later. My aim with this talk is quite simple, so to speak. I would like to provide an examination of the concept of, in particular, visual metaphor, so from the point of view of my own discipline, which is semiotics. In doing so, I hope to provide you, especially the students, a vademecum onto this subject. And I refer particularly to those students that are approaching the subject for the very first time. It is not easy at all to navigate through the plethora of concepts, typologies, and applications of metaphors and visual metaphors that have been laid out throughout the centers. So I have taken the idea of the school, the semiotic school, quite literally, I would say. So the main purpose of this talk is, therefore, a recapitulation of what has been said in semiotics about metaphor, and in particular about the visual element of metaphor. Don't get me wrong, this is not supposed to be a fully fledged theory of metaphors, nor it represents an exhaustive outlook, as the limits of time and space impose a selection of the authors and the material that I can treat with you. Before I continue, let me also provide you a quick signpost about the title. As you check the leaflet of the program of the International Summer School, my title has been changed. I have replaced the first part of the title, figurative ways into meaning making, with a terminology that I believe it is a little bit more appropriate, more succinct, and in my opinion, also more incisive. I use the term oblique semiotics, and I borrow this terminology from Algirdas Gray Mass semiotics. Indeed, this term comes from the well-known article entitled The Reduction Comfort. I'm sure all of you have heard about this paper and have read it already. Here, Gramas discusses the distinction between plausibility, veracity, truth, and certitude. And he writes that the language of connotations are basically understood as a type of oblique semiotics. So they constitute the language of connotation a type of oblique semiotics. So in my opinion, this terminology lays out well a sort of idea of laterality, of lateral thinking, of obliquity that somewhat characterizes all types of metaphorical expression and metaphorical thinking. So the structure, the backbone of the presentation is as follows. First of all, I provide you some general background about this issue, and I will point out why this subject is important today. Then I will lay out some of the main definitions and features of visual metaphor in particular. Then I will move to semiotic theories of metaphors and visual metaphors, and then finally, I will draw some conclusions and open up the discussion with you. So first, then, a few background notes about what can be called an iconic avalanche or an epidemic of images. The flood of verbal and mostly visual messages produced and distributed in contemporary societies create what Johann von Huberta has termed an iconic avalanche or an epidemic of images. As he writes in his book, The Fury of Images, and I quote, "For the first time, we are both producers and consumers of images, and the simultaneous accumulation of these factors has resulted in an almost endless iconic avalanche. We are thus passing through an era in which images are included into the category of excess, an era in which we speak of a mass production that leads to asphyxiation rather than emancipation. The idea of excess of images, which seems to produce at the same time hypervisibility and universal voyeurism, this apparent epidemic of images deserves a more in-depth and critical treatment that involves not only the specific conditions of the image, but also the logics of its management and dissemination and control," end of quote. Von Huberta was writing in 2018, so this is a time where there was not much hype around artificial intelligence. So if this is not enough to contend with, you may think of the proliferation of images created ex nihilo, that is, synthetic images entirely crafted through artificial intelligence means that seem to challenge the very idea of photography understood as il s'arrêtait, so it was, as Roland Barthes famously pointed out. Or you may think as well of the much debated issues of text-to-image generation, that technological advances such as DALL-E, Stable Diffusions, and other inventions have given rise to recent days. I think you'll be hearing about these issues in some of the student presentations that will follow these days. One of my favorite examples is this one. This is the winner, by the way, of the Sony photography contest. It is a picture which was created by Boris Elderson. So this picture was never taken, and yet it won the contest of a very prestigious photographic contest. Another good example is the one of Raphael Fabre. He was tinkering with the idea of fooling the French authorities with the creation of an ID card, a real ID card, by providing them an image of himself, which was entirely crafted by synthetic means. And by the way, he managed to get the issue of this true ID card with the fake photo. Well, you may discuss these examples in terms of simulacra, if you wish, a la Baudrillard, or you can frame them in terms of what Hans Belting has termed cyberfaces, which are simply a reproduction of images of faces that do not correspond to anybody there in flesh and bones, so masks without faces. But besides the obvious and important aspect of the verisimilitude in visual images, a topic that fascinates quite a bit. Those types of images make us think about the very logic behind the creation of images. That is to say, the production of discourses and the production of images as technology. So the production of images as technology. Let me clarify this point. It was indeed Jürgen Heinrich Lottmann who pointed out that one way to think of rhetoric is to think of it in terms of its technological character. So rhetoric as technology. Indeed, there is a technological character of rhetoric, as rhetoric, by definition, is to be understood also as the science of text generation. So this definition of rhetoric laid out by Lottmann indeed sets the opposition between science of text generation and science of text interpretation. And here, of course, the reference to rhetoric as a technology is to the science of text generation. So now, a good question for us to ask ourselves would be the following. So whether we do live in a time that is marked by a resurgence of rhetoric, a new sort of a renaissance, so to speak, and thus one should ask, what is the place of metaphoric thinking and expression today, and what is its place among other modeling systems? In one of his works on metaphors, which was already cited before, Umberto Eco concludes that there are no algorithms of metaphors and for metaphors. And given the stage of technological development of the time he was writing, he would bet that it would be impossible to prompt a computer for generating metaphors. He was writing in the 1980s, by the way. So what are the new ways and the new technologies of text interpretation is still an open question, and I think it should be discussed. And it's also a very key question and a very fascinating one. Now, on metaphor and more generally on rhetoric waits a ballast of more than 2,000 years. And the interest and appreciation of this very old science has been uneven throughout centuries. Semiotics, if nothing else, had at least the merit of having cleared rhetoric out of the world of classicism, seeing rhetoric as a useful tool for analyzing forms of persuasion, in particular in the world of advertising and marketing. There are, however, some historical and some geographical differences that should be noted, I believe. While indeed in the Anglo-Saxon area, there has always been respect and attention for rhetoric, as evidenced by the works of Ivory Richards, the philosophy of rhetoric, and also as it is shown by the works of the Neo-Aristotelian School of Chicago. So Wellek and Warren, Brooks and Wimsatt, to mention but a few. In Italy, for instance, the influence of process aesthetics, with its devaluation of the technical aspect of the work through rhetoric, much in despair and in disrepute. So much so that we began to speak of rhetoric in Italy on the wave of the first discoveries, indeed in the 1960s, of formalism, of structuralism, and of semiotics. And this is a merit that no one can deny or no one can take away from semiotics. Drawing up a semiotics of the visual metaphor is indeed a task of no small difficulty, because it means questioning a polysemic and difficult concept, and also unraveling a complex phenomenon with uncertain boundaries. Metaphor is not a precise term, let alone visual metaphor. Max Black, in 1955, once wrote that metaphor is a loose term at best, and we must be aware of attributing to it stricter rules of usage than are usually found in practice. Indeed, metaphor is definitely a hard nut to crack. In more than 2,000 years of study, metaphor has resisted every attempt to develop a stringent theory and any effort to pigeonhole it into well-defined categories. Indeed, the attempt of any rhetoric theory has been to tame, so to speak, to master an object of study that is intrinsically indomitable and elusive. Metaphor, then, is a subject that would make even far more experienced researchers and professors than me tremble their wrists. First of all, because the bibliography on the subject is vast, and its vastness grows year by year. 2 large bibliographies were devoted to the subject since the 1970s. The first one is the one by Schibels, which listed approximately 4,000 entries. It was followed by the work of Van Noppen in 1985, in which was covering the publications after 1970s. And from 1985 up to now, you can imagine how much has been written onto the subject. Secondly, it is also difficult to discuss metaphor because, as it was already anticipated in an essay written by Umberto Eco in the 1980s, it is hard to say anything new about this concept after Aristotle's first extensive treatment of the subject more than 2,000 years ago, as it was already pointed out before. This makes the subject particularly challenging, in my opinion. Eco complained, Umberto Eco, that very often the definitions of metaphor that we find in the various dictionaries and treatises on the subject are nothing more than tautologies or circular definitions that actually do not tell much either what a metaphor is or how it should work. Yet, as the scientific literature on the subject has humbly shown, we think in metaphors, and it is therefore clear that the cognitive aspect and the metaphorical mechanism cannot be treated separately and should be discussed in tandem. Moreover, not only in literature, in poetry, and the arts are metaphors widely used, but as Lakoff and Johnson famously pointed out, metaphors permeate everyday life as well. If this is not enough to contend with, metaphoric thinking constitutes as well the backbone of scientific revolutions, of creativity, and of invention. In a recent book entitled The Psychology of Totalitarianism, the clinical psychologist Matthias Desmet discusses the psychological effects of science and describes, in my opinion, quite convincingly, both the achievements and the negative effects of scientific progress. After an excursus on the emergence of scientific and rational thought in Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Lorentz, and many other great scientists, Desmet concludes, however, that the idea that science consists of making logical connections between objects and observable facts is in itself quite misleading. He writes, in fact, that scientific practice is actually more about empathy than one would expect. In other words, he claims that science is based on a resonant affinity between the observer and the phenomena under investigation. In this regard, Desmet quotes René Thom, who believed that the vast majority of the most significant theoretical advances in the history of scientific thought have stemmed from the ability of their inventors to put themselves, so to speak, in the skin of things. That is to say, to be able to empathize and to resonate with entities in the external world. As such, this method explains science constantly stumbles upon an essence that is in itself unknowable and mysterious, and that can only be described through the language of poetry and through the language of metaphor, rather than through the mathematical and numerical discourse. Among the semioticians, Yuri Mihailovich Lotman again laid out very well a parallel between poetry and scientific imagination, a parallel that is indeed grounded in metaphorical thinking. I will come back to this point at the end phase of my presentation. I will now briefly engage with semiotic and rhetoric and lay out some asymmetries that the study of metaphors has had in our fields. First of all, a topic that is so loaded with rhetorical, linguistic, and poetic connotations could not but find a privileged position among literary theory, linguistics, the philosophical disciplines, as well as epistemology of science and cognitive science, which have devoted numerous comparative studies and field research to it. This is significant as it highlights a certain agreement between linguistics, epistemology, cognitive theory, and semiotics, not only in terms of their research agendas and theoretical perspectives, but also in terms of empirically collected data. So this highlights a sort of a quantitative asymmetry between these disciplines. Compared to other fields, indeed, semiotics has devoted far less research to metaphor, although semiotic inputs to this area of investigation were very valuable. Likewise, another asymmetry that can be registered between the number of studies devoted to metaphoric expression as tropes and figures of speech, which has received a lot of attention as compared to the visual aspect of metaphor. I will now go to some terminological distinctions, that is to say, broader versus narrower meaning of metaphor, classical versus modern concept of metaphor, linguistic versus visual metaphor, and what is called non-linguistic metaphors as well. To start with, it should be said that there are two meanings in which the concept of metaphor is usually used, a broad one and a narrow one. The first one, the broad one, comes from Aristotle, who in the Poetics pointed out that metaphor is defined as the use of a word or a noun of another time, or as the transfer to an object of the proper name of another object. In the narrow sense of the term, instead, metaphor indicates one of the tropes within the array of all possible tropes. In this sense, metaphor is, alongside of metonymy, synecdoche, hyperbole, irony, etc., one of the variations of metaphor in the broader sense of the term. Another distinction, which is to be found in the literature, at least from the work of Ivory Richards, and that it has become customary, is to dwell on the fact that metaphor has historically been at the center of at least two diametrically opposed theoretical considerations. On the one hand, there is the so-called classical theory, according to which metaphor can be interpreted as a phenomenon of substitution of a proper term by a figurative term. This conception, the so-called classical theory, has at least two corollaries, as Giovanni Manetti pointed out. The first is that the metaphorical phenomenon is situated at the level of the individual lexical expression. The second corollary is that it constitutes a pure stylistic procedure, which in fact produces an ornamentation of the discourse and does not in itself entail any knowledge enhancement. Opposed to this conception of metaphor, there is what is called a contemporary conception, according to which metaphor, far from being a mere ornament of discourse, is instead an essentially cognitive phenomenon which expresses its creativity in the capacity to produce a different organization of the world. Now, take, of course, all these terminological distinctions with a pinch of salt, as they are not ingrained in stone. For instance, already in ancient Greece, with Aristotle, the term metaphor was understood in a very broad meaning, as a genus in which other rhetorical figures would belong. Likewise, if you go to the Baroque conception of metaphor, as laid out by Emanuele Tesauro in his Il Canocchiale Aristotelico, also in his conception, the understanding of metaphor was very broad. It was not limited to linguistic tropes and included a variety of science systems, to mention but a few: architecture, arts, visuals, etc., etc. So these are examples of broad understanding of metaphors prior to a contemporary conception of metaphor. We'll now move to the theme of the summer school, visual metaphor. So although this thematic framing of the school focuses on visual metaphor, and if therefore the reference to the sphere or modality of vision and visual somewhat circumscribes the object of investigation, thus sparing us an examination on the nature and the function of the linguistic metaphor from Aristotle up to now. However, it is true that the conceptual metaphor is often taken as the benchmark against which such visual metaphors are generally assessed. Indeed, metaphor as a figure of speech is often referred to as a terminus ad quo. Metaphor as in fact being spoken of primarily in linguistic terms, or it is taken as a benchmark, that is to say, as a method of comparison between linguistic metaphor and visual metaphor. I will give you an example of what I'm talking about here, about this approach. The subject of visual metaphor is addressed with quite a reductive approach, I would say, in the sphere of Russian formalism, where the visual metaphor is indeed conceived only in the dimension of a direct reference to verbal metaphor. In this sense, it is a particular realization, visually precisely, of a metaphor which is already autonomously existing in the speech of the actual and possible modes of verbalization. So there is an already existing metaphor in language which is basically expressed through the visual medium. Russian formalisms, for instance, referred to the cinematic metaphor, which, for instance, would be nothing other than the visual translation of the figure already realized in its completeness in words. So a translation of signifies bound to a semic content already verbalized and not enriched, or in any case, transformed or estranged by the manipulation undergone on the level of expression. The cinematic metaphor, therefore, would be reduced to the visualization of a verbal metaphor already explicitly known to the author and to the receiver of the communication. Now, as an alternative to this view, visual metaphor has been recently seen as an overcoming of the linguistic metaphor and its constraints. In other words, visual metaphor is often seen as an extension that goes far beyond language and embraces other horizons and other possible ways of describing things indirectly or obliquely. In this regard, we speak indeed of non-linguistic metaphors, an umbrella term in which baskets fall a plethora of various types of metaphors: visual, gestural, auditory, and even perhaps olfactory metaphors. It was, by the way, during the years from 1970 to 1980 that the shift from a narrow focus on language to a broader interdisciplinary approach to this topic took place. Let us make clear from the outset, however, that the term visual metaphor is somewhat vague and obscure, or at least questionable, and in any case, it should be not treated lightly. In fact, one could ask what the term visual metaphor stands for, and even argue whether visual metaphors per se are really different from other types of metaphors. Indeed, these are images that may evoke metaphors, and therefore, such images can operate on a metaphorical level too, functioning just as a linguistic metaphor would. However, this does not mean to say that metaphors do not operate on a visual level and that there are not mutual and complex relations between language and vision. Quite the contrary. Having said that, however, we should perhaps ponder what the visual metaphor is and, at the very least, subject this terminology to careful and close assessment. So what is a visual metaphor? The first question arising in a discussion of visual metaphor is indeed what that is. An answer to this at the outset would seem appropriate. The problem with this question is that there is no unified theory of visual metaphors that currently exists. As Contini pointed out, the study of visual metaphors involves many disciplines that not always have a common ground. And the definitions of visual metaphors given by different authors vary according to the standpoint of their departure. Some of the definitions of visual metaphors are, for instance, the following. A visual metaphor is a metaphor that uses the visual medium, a type of metaphor, the component elements of which are rendered in visual terms, or metaphors in which both target and source are exclusively or predominantly rendered visually. Needless to say, all these definitions are not very precise because one could wonder what do we mean by visual, what do we mean by mode, what do we mean by medium, etc., etc. A common solution to sort out this kind of problems is to stipulate a set of features and use then visual metaphor to refer to that set of things that have all or only those characteristics. But again, the features underscored are not univocal and may vary. Some examples of visual metaphor, perhaps, for instance, provided by Contini are the following. The heads of Giuseppe Arcimboldo, where the parts of the human face are basically replaced with vegetable and fruits, but you can still recognize the face and the shape and the pattern of the head and face. This image implies what she calls an operation of suppression addition. And there are many other ways to characterize and to construct visual metaphor. So the nose, in this case, is substituted with an image of a pear on the basis of some common properties of nose and ear, etc., etc. But if we go back to semiotic theory now, we should ask what semiotics has done in this field. Here I'll move to some of the main semiotic approaches to the subject and then end with a conclusion. First of all, a note on methodology. I shall proceed with the discussion of currently held theories of metaphor, and generally I will limit my examination to theories that are set forth by scholars who are either recognized themselves as semanticians or have been recognized by others as such. And also I comment on the theories upon which they base their arguments. Let us say that at the outset, that the definition of rhetoric in semiotic terms is the one that was put forward, first of all, by Roland Barthes in his article Rhétorique de l'image. of the classifications of connotators, that is, signifiers of connotators. As you all know, Barthes writes that, and I quote, "The signifiers of connotation, which we shall call connotators, are made up of signs, signifiers, and signified united of the denoted system. As for the signified of connotation, its character is at once general, global, and diffuse. It is, if you like, a fragment of ideology." And famously, as you know, he analyzed the rhetoric of the image in this famous Tanzani reclam of the pasta, which has become a cult book example in our textbooks of semiotics. But besides Barthes, we owe to Roman Jakobson one of the main contributions to clarify the meaning of both tropes in general and their concrete species, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, irony, etc., especially in line with semiotic thinking. Jakobson, as it is well known, identifies two main species of tropes, metaphor and metonymy, and links them to the two fundamental axes of language, the paradigmatic and the syntagmatic. Metaphor is, according to Jakobson, the substitution of a concept along the paradigmatic axis, which is related to the choice of paradigmatic series, to the substitution in absentia, and to the establishment of a semantic link by affinity. Metonymy is arranged along the syntagmatic axis and constitutes not a choice, but an union in presentia and the establishment of a bond of continuity. An early example, which I have no time to discuss with you today, is, however, to be at least pointed out. This was a paper by Guy Consiepe, who perhaps is the first attempt to treat in semiotic terms the equivalence of linguistic rhetoric to visual rhetoric. He points out a difference between syntactic features and semantic features and makes up a whole typology of visual types of tropes. The syntactic figures are laid out in a tripartite disposition, transpositive, privative, and repetitive, and then semantic features are divided into two heads, comparative and substitutive. Within the domain of semiotics, as was already pointed out before, Umberto Eco on various occasions has devoted attention to metaphor, drawing, as we already pointed out, on Aristotle, the semiotics of the group of the age as well, and other sources. He developed his own metaphorics. Eco's take on metaphors would deserve a study ex professor, and it cannot be disposed of in few words now. There are, however, some benchmarks that we can very quickly highlight before our discussion. First of all, the intersection between visual and verbal metaphors. Secondly, the need of interlocking a semiotic of metaphors with the semiotics of culture. And thirdly, the cognitive function of metaphors. I will now end up with another semiotician, which is perhaps more close, at least to my background, which is Yuri Lotman. In the Tartu Moscow Semiotic School, there are at least two names that should be mentioned when discussing metaphors and visual metaphors. One is Yuri Levin, and the other one is indeed Yuri Lotman. Yuri Levin devoted an article to this topic entitled "The Structure of Metaphor," in which he discusses, in particular, Russian metaphor, and he sets forth his own typology of metaphors. Yuri Lotman is more established internationally than Yuri Levin. However, Lotman is probably more known for his work on the poetics of the artistic texts, and of course his works on the semiotics of culture and semisphere, but it is perhaps less known for his work on rhetoric and metaphor. Yet I believe he had some very interesting ideas on the subject as well. In 1980s, he published an entry devoted to rhetoric in the Italian Encyclopedia Einaudi, where he dwells on metaphoric expression and rhetoric from the perspective of cultural semiotics. Start with Lotman's point of departure is very different from the other approaches discussed up to now, as he starts from the premise that consciousness and the thinking mechanism is, in general, and by definition, heterogeneous. As it is well known for Lotman, the minimal thinking device must include at least two systems of different structure that exchange information processed within these systems. The idea of heterogeneity of the thinking mechanism is predicated upon another idea, that is to say, the analogy that exists between the functioning of the two cerebral hemispheres and the organization of culture as a collective mind. For Lotman, in both cases, one discovers the presence of, at the very least, two radical different ways of reflecting the world and processing information with the subsequent complex text exchange mechanism between the systems. As a way to explain how two different systems operate and interact with each other, Lotman resorts to the difference between discrete and continuous texts and continuous systems. A corollary to this discussion, thus, is the distinction between continuous and discrete codification, which accounts for two different modalities of decoding the information received. Whilst the continuous systems we deal with continuous functions, discrete codification is based on discrete step intervals, as in the case of analogic versus digital communication. For Lotman, two types of text generations are thus hidden within both the individual and the collective mind. One is based on the mechanism of discontinuity and the other is continuous. Between these systems, there is an uninterrupted exchange of texts and communications that take place in the form of semantic translation from one system to another. I make the last point and I conclude. In principle, any extract and any exact translation implies that univocal relationships are established between the two units of two systems, which allows the text of one language to be expressed by means of the other. But when juxtaposing discrete and non-discrete texts, this is in principle impossible. This leads to under these conditions, the situation that Lotman calls the situation of untranslatability arises. And we know very well that it is precisely here that attempts at translations are realized with particular tendency and yields the most valuable results. In this case, one does not have the exact translation, but an approximate equivalence. This irregular and inexact, but in certain sense equivalent translation constitutes for Lotman an essential element of all creative thinking. It is precisely this irregular juxtaposition that gives impulses for the emergence of new semantic links and radically new texts. The last quote, and I end. As he writes in this entry encyclopedia, a pair of mutually incongruous signifying elements between which an adaptive relationship is established within a context forms a semantic trope. In this sense, tropes are not an external ornament, but constitute the essence of creative thinking, and their sphere is even broader than art. It belongs to creation in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. I understand why the organizers chose you as an opening speaker, and thank you for speaking up to the timeline. So, if you have any questions, I would like to ask you come forward like before and ask through the microphone.
Thank you very much, Remo, for this very interesting presentation. So when you said at the beginning, like that the metaphor, like doesn't have an algorithm. So I would like to connect this to Martin's previous talk about how metaphor is connected to our these living beings. So is it in that sense possible that what makes us living beings is this ability to metaphor, because either AI or ChatGPT can or Siri can produce actually algorithms for metaphors. So what do you think of that?
Thank you for the question, first of all. That's a quotation which I've taken from Umberto Eco's article, which is called On Metaphor, indeed. And if you pay attention to the conclusions that he gives, it is exactly that quote, that for metaphors there is not a formula, a precise formula, and there is not an algorithm. As I pointed out also in my presentation, he says that it would be very tough to ask a computer to formulate some metaphors, but at the time we are dwelling at this moment, perhaps we should rephrase this conclusion and find out whether algorithms are unable to produce metaphors. Probably yes, probably no. It is an open question, yet something to think about.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, so you said you mentioned this avalanche of images. I mean, I understand the images are everywhere. The images are essential. We see images in imagination. We see images in dreams. We see them everywhere. But what about those people who are blind, who have never ever in their life seen the images? Maybe who were born blind. How do you explain the visual metaphor to those people? So have everything completely dark. Could darkness also be understood as this visual metaphor for them? Maybe.
Excellent question. I'm not an expert of studying cognitive impairment due to blind vision, but I assume that probably there would be other senses that would work out in order to produce metaphoric images for them. And also, by the way, it doesn't mean that the sort of demarcation we are making between visual and non-visual, I think is a little bit artificial. First of all, because if you take, classical accounts, also semiotic accounts on metaphors, they stress the fact that we shouldn't ask, okay, are there visual metaphors? Are there pictorial metaphors? Are there musical metaphors, etc.? But we should rather ask what is the mutual relationship between those modalities. And both Jacobson, made this claim already in the 50s, 60s. Eccles as well made this claim. And in my understanding, although they do not dwell exactly on the concept of visual metaphors, they still operate in a way that give us some hints as to how those metaphors works over other semantic systems that are not linguistic.
Okay, no other questions? So please come forward.
Hi, Remo. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I agree with Anna. It was totally amazing.
Thank you.
And I want to relate to Anna's question, the first one. So she was asking about the metaphors produced by AI. And I know you are also expert in ostension theory. So I wanted to ask about your opinion on this topic, whether deep fakes or the picture you showed us, the fake ID photography, can we consider this kind of science like metaphors? Because metaphor should be based on some similarity or similitude, but this is more like a fake or a forgery. So in this case, what is the boundary between ostension and metaphor?
Thank you. Excellent question once again. First of all, it depends what is your point of departure. What is your understanding of metaphor first? So, I don't know, if we take a Lotmanian stance, for instance, as the one I just laid out, so that tropes and metaphors are given in the situation of incompatibility, then yes, in a way, those are impossible, as they are not compatible, right? There is not such a thing of a of a face, right, which does not ontologically belong to a human being, and yet there is a representation of a face that aesthetically has all the characteristics and all the features of that face. So in a way, there is a clash of meaning. There is a sort of a irrational characteristic that, in a way, justifies this. But yet, one of the benchmark of the theory of metaphors in semiotics was that they have to have a cognitive hinge. So they have to produce new knowledge, right, in order to be sort of true metaphors. Umberto Eco relies on the fourth type of metaphor laid out by Aristotle, and he claims that in that fourth case, metaphor gives about something new that the speakers didn't know before. So the question we should ask ourselves is, do we learn more with these images? Is there any new knowledge that comes about from it? And therefore, once we have set out our criteria of understanding, perhaps we can provide an answer as well. But I'm a little bit skeptical in calling them metaphors in the way in which the tradition is done. But I might think twice. Thank you.
Thanks for your excellent presentation. So I'm curious if you could lay out a little bit more sort of the with this conclusion, going back to your new subtitle of the sort of obliqueness and how if that's referring to the diagonality of the Gramscian square, and also in the context of metaphor, you know, vis-a-vis this question of with Eco, if it can be algorithmic or not, remembering that every time you put it in the same prompt, you get a very different thing out. So is it algorithmic, or is it, you could say, just stochastic in some sense? And so is it not, in essence, doing the work of a metaphor, which is connecting a specific meaning that can be traced back, right? And so I think that there's some ambiguity there that can be teased out, especially if we remember that these images are not generated ex nihilo. They are instead built on the corpus of mainly Western civilization, but all of the images that were available 2021 prior on the internet. And so that there is this sort of real sense of, instead of being more like a DJ, right? Like remixing and rematching already little bits of signification. And what happens when we sort of fragment the gestalt of the metaphors which these works of art did represent. And if we're instead dealing with something of how techne and poesis sort of can supervene on each other in different ways, and when you have sort of the triumph of techne, what does that do to poesis?
Thank you once again. And I'll take the opportunity to explain also the subtitle of my lecture here. I wasn't very happy with the first formulation of my title because it related to, let's say, a classicist way of understanding metaphor, which is, you know, the opposition between literal and figurative. The first formulation of my title was, in fact, figurative ways into meaning making. So I wanted to avoid that. But having said that, and having provided a more general title, I also wanted to give, you know, a way towards this term, which is not only sexy, oblique semiotics, but also has some value. There, in that article, Gray Mass talks about, you know, the way in which we can create a framework that not only includes the language of connotations, but also includes other types of semiotic theory. Lotman, first of all, typology of cultures and typology of texts, Barth as well, and also the distinction, you know, pointed out by Jaroslav between content and expression. And in his account of the 1960s, 70s, this type of synthesis was not yet arrived, and probably is not yet arrived even today. So I take it more as a personal challenge as a researcher to sort of combine these two concepts, the language of connotations as something which is oblique, with also the way in which metaphors somewhat operate. Of course, I do not mean to say that all metaphorical thinking is oblique. Yeah, of course, it is indirect, but we should, look for other features and definitions to define it. As for the second question instead, very fascinating one. Well, luckily, the computer scientists don't know about semiotics, luckily. What do I mean by that? Well, if they would have read the essay of Umberto Eco, in which he explains the difference between dictionary and encyclopedia, they would definitely come up with a model of artificial intelligence that would use that difference. As he explains in his paper, it is impossible to use a dictionary definition, a semantics based on dictionary definitions, because you must have a very in-depth encyclopedic definitions of the terms you use for the substitutions. Now, if you apply this to the concept of artificial intelligence, I think the results would enhance at an enormous rate if some semiotic knowledge would be taken into account. But luckily, we're not yet there.
So, last question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I like very much. Okay, I'll try to.
Maybe try it again.
No?
Does it work? No, it's not working.
It's okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I really like your Lotman's account. And here comes my question. In his article, Rhetoric as a Music Generating System, and you're thinking about tapes as minimum of thinking devices. I like very much this Lotman's idea. And here comes my question. Lotman speaks of not of visual metaphor as much, but as some meta-metaphors. So metaphors like a conceptual space which could help us deal with isomorphic, wider arrangement of concepts and ideas and so on. What do you think about this intersection between visual and meta-metaphors?
Thank you. Wonderful. First of all, yeah, well, these are not my ideas. I have taken it from Lotman, so we should praise his ability to lay out things in a effective way. But he has this term already included in his article, in a sense. Yes, the last few paragraphs in which he discusses indeed the idea of not meta-metaphors, but of meta-rhetoric. And in his understanding, a meta-rhetoric would be exactly the way in which we can be able to describe the minimal mechanism of invention, of creation of new texts. And this is given by what he calls the situation of incompatibility. But he even comes up with a formula, surprisingly, according to which, contrary to what Umberto Eco and others were claiming, that of course you need to have a common ground for the comparison of two things which are diametrically different, and this is done by a classification of sims and simims. So you must have some commonality. Take the example of the face in which the attributes are substituted with fruits. Of course, between the ear and the nose, you must have some scenes that are similar, okay? They are both pointing, and you may come up with other qualities in order to make this comparison. But the thing interesting is that Lotman comes with this formula according to which the more the metaphor is created on very distant scenes, so on something that would be impossible to compare, because you wouldn't come up with this sort of analogy. There is the maximum of the effects of the tropes, which I find in a way fascinating, and on the other way also difficult if we take into consideration what has been done with componential semantics and with the semantics of the encyclopedia. But I like that idea. And also he points out, again, in a very collapsing way, that he collapses two perspectives, the fact that metaphor is irrational in a way, irrational. So because it puts up together things that shouldn't be there, but at the same time it is hyper-rationalized, it's hyper-codified. So there are some, interesting bits and bytes from that article that I think we should take into account. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so for those who are staying at the dorms, so first of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of the dorms for all the chaos with the Wi-Fi connection. And there is a piece of paper seriously relating somewhere with a new password and username. So you can also find this information at the registration desk, at the reception of the dorms. But there are two important middle steps if you want to connect to the Wi-Fi. So you have to enter the identity or the username and the password. Plus, in the settings, you have to select phase 2 and select do not identify, and the same for the CA certificate. So it's all written on that piece of paper. And if you are sharing a room, please just leave the key at the reception every time you leave the dorms. So that's for dorms. And now we have coffee break, and we are taking a picture. So the group picture is being taken right now in front of this building. So if you can all just please group in front of this building, and then you can grab a coffee.
Oh, he's there.
No jasně, ale taky takový nějaký začáteční den.
Jo, jako bylo to asi, no.
Tady to nejde pohodlně, ale jakože
Ale čo, prostě to tady zamykat, nebo to bude otevřený?
já si myslím, že chvilku ještě otevřený, tady lidi mají věci.
Já právě taky, tak se...
Dokud je ta pauza, tak to bude asi otevřený.
Okay.
So does this work?
To by měl být určitý trojnou teď. Prostě možná kikne baterky, protože to nějak nereaguje, nesvítí nic. To by podobně, když to jako vytáhneš, to bys to...
Ono to ani nesvítí, tohle jo, a tohle ne.
Když to šroubuješ, tak najdeš baterku. Bude normálně.
Dejme tomu třeba minutu.
OK.
Jestli
Můžeme čeknout tu promítačku a vrátit se.
Jo, tam už někdo ale něco dělá, bo jak jsem dělala. Ačku, kde se zapolají.
Jo, můžu už.
Jo.
No, snažím udělat to. Proč to nefungovalo? A jestli tohle, to není tady v těch, tady.
Jakože už se nám podařilo dát, aby se nabíjel.
Jo,
To se
super.
předtím nedělo, takže se nabíjí.
To jsou vlastně potom ty...
Jo, jasně. OK. Tak, takže tady si normálně teda... Jasně.
Aha, co jsi nejde?
Tak utíkej, dokud tam něco je.
Hey, check.
So